Chapter 1891. Weshing sneered. Whenever I don't take my medicine, I'll let you see if I can do it. Linda glared at him. This shameless guy, who said that Weshing was a famous gentleman in Hong Kong. In her opinion, he was just a shameless old hooligan. Linda ignored him and leaned against the back of the chair, still looking a little pained. No matter what, Weshing wouldn't be calculative with a little girl. So he pulled her back onto his shoulder. Bear with it. The test results will be out soon. Linda originally wanted to avoid him, but his arms were quite warm. She hesitated for a moment and then leaned back. Then she said childishly, "Will I die?" Weshing looked down at her and laughed. "I've never heard of anyone dying from eating hairy crabs. If there is, it's because they died of stupidity." He didn't think so at first, but now he felt that it was interesting to be with this girl. At least she wasn't afraid of him and wouldn't flirt with him, which made him feel comfortable and relaxed. Linda looked at him and held her stomach. "It hurts. You're a bad guy." "Yes, I'm a bad guy." The mature man teased her and dared to say anything. "Even a bad guy doesn't have a bucket in your stomach." Linda glared at him. "Weshing, you're so shameless." He just smiled. He looked up and saw the nurse coming over. He looked a little anxious. Weshing's smiling face suddenly sank. He looked at the nurse and said in a low voice, "What's wrong?" The nurse's voice was also anxious. "This lady needs to be transferred." Linda's expression changed. She was timid. She was really afraid of death. Weshing put his arm around her shoulder and comforted her. "She won't be transferred to the brain department, right?" He looked at her sideways. "I don't think your brain is working well." Linda was about to cry. She said in a sobbing voice, "Weshing." The nurse quickly said, "Don't be too nervous. However, this might be a good thing for you. Being sick is a good thing." Linda didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The nurse explained, "This lady is transferred to the obstetrics department. Isn't that a good thing?" This gentleman wasn't young. Wasn't it a happy thing to have a child at such an old age? Obstetrics? Linda and Weshing looked at each other. Then, Linda lowered her head and gently stroked her belly with her fingers. Her voice was also trembling. "Are you serious, nurse? I'm not married yet." "It's fine as long as you have a boyfriend. If your boyfriend doesn't acknowledge you, that's too much of a scumbag," the nurse said without thinking. Then, she looked at Weshing and stared at her for quite a while. Weshing felt upset in his heart. He was a man, so he would bear the responsibility that he should bear. However, Linda did not say that the child was his. Linda howled, "I don't have a boyfriend." She clutched her head with both hands and pulled at her hair. Oh no, I'm pregnant." The nurse looked back and forth between their faces and asked hesitantly, "Then is this gentleman your father?" Linda was stunned. Weshing's face turned black. Was he that old? His gaze fell on Linda's face and his voice was cold. "Tell her, what is our relationship?" Linda saw that he was so angry, and her heart was like a dog. She was very sad and in pain, okay? Why was he the one getting angry? So he put on a fake smile and said, "It's a good relationship." Weshing wished she could kill her. Chapter 1892. The nurse's eyes were filled with disdain. She despised these old men the most. They played with women just because they had money. Hence, she said coldly, "All right, go to the obstetrics department. The doctor is already there. This lady is pregnant and can't eat anything cold. There might be signs of miscarriage. Go quickly. Do you want to save her or not? Hurry." The nurse still had many things to do and left first. Anyway, there was still a tycoon there. Linda and Weshing were left staring at each other. His expression wasn't kind, and Linda looked like she was about to cry. "If I hadn't come to be city, what would you have done with the child?" he asked coldly. For some reason, looking at the tears in her eyes, he could guess that the child in her stomach belonged to him, Weshing. All these years, he hadn't had many women, but he hadn't left a seed in anyone's stomach. He had always been very careful. Even that time with Linda, his men had watched her take the drug. Linda looked at his expression and couldn't guess what he was thinking. However, she knew that he wasn't the right man for her. What kind of relationship did they have now? They weren't even buddies. They had only slept together because of a mistake. And she had already taken his money. What was the point of relying on him now that she was pregnant? Her voice was a little hoarse. Mr. Du, don't worry. I won't let you take responsibility. Taking a deep breath, he said, I'll take care of it myself. With that, he endured the pain in his stomach and walked towards the elevator. With every step she took, her tummy heaved up and down. Only then did she truly feel the presence of her child. Linda had been hesitant at first because of the accident, and because Du Yueshing didn't want it. Actually, even if he had said that he wanted this child, even if he didn't marry her, she would have given birth to it. But now her stomach was in so much pain. If she didn't want this child, would it be even more painful than it was now? Linda's tears fell. She walked into the elevator and looked at her own face. As the elevator went up, she kept looking at herself in the mirror. She knew that she had to give up a lot to have this child. She didn't lack money. Du Yueshing had already given her a lot last time. She had to give up her job temporarily. She had to bear the pressure of being a single mother. She had to give up on the young talents of King Entertainment. But looking at her face in the mirror, Linda smiled. These were all nothing. She wanted this child. She smiled with tears in her eyes. She went to the obstetrics department alone. The doctor told her that she was already 2 months pregnant. Her stomach hurt because of a threatened miscarriage. If she wanted to keep the baby, she had to be hospitalized. Okay, I'll be hospitalized. Linda took out her ID and asked the nurse to handle the hospitalization procedures. When she laid on the hospital bed and connected the drip, she watched as the water dripped down drop by drop, as if it was injected into her baby. His fingers gently caressed his lower abdomen, and the corners of his mouth rose into a smile. It was amazing that she accepted the child just like that without any hesitation. But the medicine had a calming effect, and within an hour she was asleep. When Du Yueshing came in, he saw her lying quietly with her fingers on her abdomen. He stood by the bed for a long time, thinking about what the doctor had told him. Chapter 1893. She was too young, too impulsive, too silly. Maybe in a few days, she would change her mind. Du Yueshing thought so. He didn't particularly desire this child. He didn't like children very much. Of course, if she really wanted to give birth to it, he could give her a sum of money and take the child away. Or if he left the child with her, he would give her living expenses. But he would still take the child away when it grew up. After all, it was impossible for his child to stay in B City. If he didn't get married in the future, this child would be his heir. He thought that when she woke up, they could have a good talk. He didn't hate Linda. In fact, he quite liked her. But he wasn't so impulsive that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He had never thought of having such a wife, nor was he prepared to accept it. Du Yueshing sat on the single sofa and stayed with her for the whole night. Halfway through, a nurse came over and looked at him. Du Yueshing was now a popular person in this hospital. The previous nurse had spread the news that this old man had a mistress, and now that she was pregnant, he probably didn't want to take responsibility. Her gaze was a little scary. Du Yueshing's face darkened, and he was naturally in a bad mood. At dawn, Linda woke up and looked at Du Yueshing in surprise. She pursed her lips and bit her lip. Why are you still here? She sat up and hugged her knees. She looked at Du Yueshing and suddenly said, The child isn't yours. I took the medicine at that time. Du Yueshing's expression changed. He had prepared a lot of things to say to her, and it was close to a negotiation. But now, with a single sentence from her, his carefully prepared words disappeared into thin air. He seemed a little ridiculous, as if he wanted her to give birth to a child for him. Although she was a little annoyed, she was still someone by Yi Liangqiu's side. He had indeed slept with her before, so she couldn't ignore this matter. Du Yueshing patiently said, Whose child is it? As long as you tell me, I'll definitely let him marry you. Linda looked at him and said after a long time, We met on a trip. Just one night. There's no emotional foundation, so forget it. Du Yueshing's old face darkened. Are you addicted to one-night stands? You were the one who drugged me that night. She snorted. Mr. Du, everyone has physiological needs, right? Du Yueshing's face darkened and her hair looked like it was about to grow grass. She said coldly, Is that so? Then why didn't you have any physical needs before we started dating? How did you manage to maintain your virginity? I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you that it was repaired. Linda said mischievously. You didn't take it seriously, did you? That's why you gave me 5 million. Du Yuesheng looked at that pretty little face and stared at it for a long time. Finally, she pursed her lips and said in an even colder voice, Since that's the case, you can decide for yourself. If you need any help, just say it. As long as I'm still in B City. After he finished speaking, Linda's expression softened. Mr. Du, thank you. Perhaps because of her good attitude, his expression became better. Silly girl, it's not a big deal. There's no need to make such a big deal out of it. Linda smiled and lowered her eyes. Actually, to her, it was as if the world was falling apart. How could she not know what he was thinking? When she woke up at night and saw his face, she knew what he was thinking. Chapter 1894. When she looked up again, she smiled sweetly at him. Mr. Du, thank you so much. Du Yuesheng was angry. As for why he was angry, he did not know. Actually, the child wasn't his, so he should be happy. But he just couldn't be happy. At this moment, the nurse and the doctor came over. After expressing their concern, they checked on the child. The doctor was young and had a gentle attitude. Ms. Ning, the child is in good condition. Linda's expression relaxed. Thank you. Stay in the hospital for 3 days for observation. If there's nothing else, you can go home and rest. The doctor patted her shoulder. Pay attention to your emotions. You have to be happy in order to have a healthy baby. Linda smiled. I'll pay attention. The doctor's nurse went out and the door closed. Du Yuesheng had been there the whole time. Just now, when the doctors and nurses looked at him, as if he was a beast, he endured it. At this moment his gaze fell on her body. He watched as her fingers gently stroked her lower abdomen. It seemed like she was very concerned about it. He squinted his eyes and asked lightly, Is that man handsome? He's quite handsome, Linda replied casually, not really paying attention. Du Yuesheng's expression turned ugly, but Linda couldn't see it. She only heard him continue to snort. Then is he very good? Linda replied, He's okay. Mr. Du's expression turned ugly. He gritted his teeth. Better than me? This time, Linda finally turned around and looked at him seriously. She coughed lightly. There's no way to compare. You took the medicine that night. Du Yuesheng touched his nose and was so angry that he didn't say anything. Linda knew that he was angry. Men always cared about this. But now she understood that he cared about this and didn't ask who the child belonged to. She thought that her decision was right. This was good too. She didn't need a marriage without feelings. And the child didn't need a father who didn't look forward to him. She looked down and touched her belly. In Du Yuesheng's eyes, she was reminiscing about the man she had a one-night stand with. His heart was in a mess. He paused and asked, Is your family in B City? If they are, call them and ask them to stay with you. He was a man and couldn't stay with her in the hospital all the time. Besides, they didn't have that kind of relationship. This was what Du Yuesheng thought. Linda shook her head. They are out of town and I don't dare to ask them to come over. If she got pregnant before marriage, her legs would be broken. She thought that if she found an excuse not to go back this Lunar New Year, she could hide the fact that the child was born in the future. When she went back, she could leave the child at Mr. Ye's house. When the child grew older, she could bring it home, and her family wouldn't be able to do anything to her. Linda admitted that she had always been a timid person, so this was the best plan. Du Yuesheng looked at her and said in a steady voice, If you're so afraid, why do you insist on having a child? Linda's fingers stroked it gently. She looked up and said childishly, Because he's not wrong. Du Yuesheng froze for a moment. Then, he seemed to hesitate for a moment before asking softly, If I didn't make you take the medicine back then, and you were pregnant with my child, would you have given birth to it? After asking, his eyes burned into her. As if her answer was very important. Linda looked straight at him and smiled. If I'm pregnant, will Mr. Du marry me? Chapter 1895. Looking at his silence, Linda thought that she understood what he meant. What he meant was exactly what she thought. She sighed inwardly. Why did he ask that when he knew it was impossible? So she smiled lightly. Of course. Maybe Mr. Du will be happy and give me a lot of money. She was smiling, but her smile was uglier than crying. He had given her 5 million for her first time. And how much was he going to sell her child? Chastity didn't matter to women nowadays, but the child was her child, her flesh and blood. How could she sell it? She could sell anything. But this was the only thing she could not sell. She had lied to Du Yuesheng. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to keep the child by her side. She knew all too well the tricks of the rich. Cinderella's story didn't apply to a realistic man like Du Yuesheng. Seeing her smile, Du Yuesheng was a little upset. He paused and said, "It seems that taking the medicine back then was the best outcome." He probably felt that those words were a little cruel, so he reached out and caressed her head. "Be more careful in the future. If you have another relationship, let the man wear it. Don't take the medicine anymore. It's harmful to the body." Linda was speechless and glared at him. "You didn't feel so bad for me that time, did you? Didn't I say that I took the medicine that time? How could I care about that?" Du Yuesheng's voice was hoarse as he thought of that night. In fact, after he returned to Hong Kong for more than a month, it wasn't that he didn't have women. He had slept with 3 or 4 women in total, but he couldn't find the feeling he had with Linda that night. No matter how attractive those women were, he just couldn't get it up. However, she was pregnant now, so it was immoral for him to think about such things. He dismissed the thought and smiled. "I'll arrange for someone to take care of you. When you leave the hospital, can you take care of yourself?" He really cared about her like an elder. To be honest, Linda felt a little better. The child's father wasn't that bad after all. She smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Du." Du Yuesheng's slender fingers gently combed her hair and suddenly said, "Call me brother from now on. I'll take this child as my godson." In his heart, he probably felt a little more pity for her and for the child. After all, the woman he had slept with was still young. The women that Du Yuesheng hung out with were mostly romantic figures. Most of them were charming women in their 30s, unlike a young lady like Linda. He was thinking that if he hadn't taken her that night, she wouldn't have easily found a man to have a one-night stand. So he still owed her. It was only natural for him to take care of her. Linda smiled. "Mr. Du, you are thinking too far ahead," she sighed faintly. "I might leave B City in the future and find a relatively smaller city. Mr. Du, you also know that it's not very honorable to get pregnant before marriage." Du Yuesheng frowned, but did not say a word. He really had no right to interfere too much with a woman he had only slept with for one night. With the matter settled, he quickly arranged for professional nurses to take care of her 24 hours a day. With Du Yuesheng's arrangements, her 3 days in the hospital were especially peaceful, and the food was top-notch. Chapter 1896. Linda was eating those high-end dishes, which were suitable for pregnant women. She thought that being rich was really good. She thought that the nurse would leave after she was discharged from the hospital, but the nurse said that Mr. Du had hired her for a month. She could go home with Linda to take care of her. Thinking that this was arranged by Du Yuesheng, Linda had nothing to worry about and enjoyed the care. Of course, she also asked for leave. The reason was maternity leave a year. After receiving the call, Yi Liangqiu almost went crazy. She tossed the phone aside and saw Qin Anlin lying on the bed with only a bathrobe on his body. He looked like he was begging for hugs and affection, begging to roll on the bed with him. Anger rose in her heart, and she threw the phone at the innocent CO Qin again. "What's wrong? Why are you so angry?" Qin Anlin pulled up the bathrobe. It could be seen that she was not in the mood to do that. It seemed to be a call from Linda just now. Did something happen to Linda? Yi Liangqiu bit her lip and stared at Qin Anlin. "Why are you men so useless? You don't even want to wear a set of clothes and make a woman pregnant." President Qin was very innocent. "Liangqiu, I've had a vasectomy." Yi Liangqiu found it funny, but she still kept a straight face. "You've made me pregnant many times, haven't you? Look at how much Tang Yu loves Chi-Chi. She only had one child after so many years." Qin Anlin snorted coldly. "That's because he's useless." After that, he licked his face. "Liangqiu, your husband is awesome, right?" He patted the seat beside him. "Come here, let's play something different tonight." Yi Liangqiu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Qin Anlin, I'm being serious. Aren't the duties and rights of a husband and wife serious? President Qin looked dissatisfied. Do you think we haven't done it this week? Yi Liangqiu went over and pinched his face. President Qin, today is Monday. As she said this, her face also turned red. He had been especially greedy recently, as if he wanted to make up for all the emptiness in the past year. He was always thinking about this kind of thing, and she didn't know where he got the energy from. Qin Anlin dragged her into his arms, kissed her and coaxed her. Shall we wear one? Yi Liangqiu was defeated by him. Qin Anlin, you've had a vasectomy. Why are you wearing a condom? So, how nice it is for us to do such things without any pressure. He smiled at him roguishly. She bit her lip, and suddenly realized that she had been coaxed by him just now. He was obviously coaxing her, because he saw that she was unhappy? Anlin, you seem to be getting better at coaxing people? She asked cautiously. Qin Anlin gave her a fake smile. Really? I think I'm a sex fiend who wants to have sex all day long. She crawled over and lay in his arms. She raised her head and kissed his face. Anlin is the best. You have a conscience. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed her. Tell me what's going on? Yi Liangqiu looked into his eyes and said slowly, Linda is pregnant. Qin Anlin frowned. Du Yuesheng's child? You think so too? Yi Liangqiu sighed. But Linda said it's not Du Yuesheng's. She said that she had a love affair during her trip. Qin Anlin laughed. She's grown up. Anyway, I don't believe it. Yi Liangqiu's expression was cold. I'll go to see her tomorrow. Chapter 1897. The next day, Yi Liangqiu went to Linda's place, and at this time, Du Yuesheng had returned to Hong Kong. Linda lived in a 2-bedroom house, which was under Yi Liangqiu's name, and the conditions were quite good. Qin Anlin was waiting in the car downstairs, and Yi Liangqiu went upstairs alone. When she opened the door, Linda was watching TV on the sofa, and the nurse was busy in the small kitchen. Linda raised her eyes, stuffed the food in her mouth, and said in a vague voice, Sister Liangqiu, so fast? She got up, pulled Yi Liangqiu to sit down, and swallowed the food. It's so delicious, come and try it. Saying that, she secretly looked at the nurse in the kitchen, and whispered, Is this nurse expensive? I really want to hire her for the next 8 months. Seeing her hopeless look, Yi Liangqiu found it funny and angry, and took a cup of tea for her to moisten her throat. Look at how greedy you are. She was hired by Du Yuesheng, you have to ask him. Yi Liangqiu's words, more or less, meant to test her. Linda suddenly felt that it was meaningless. I won't ask him. I will ask Auntie Zhao later, and I will hire her for less than a month. Yi Liangqiu seemed to ask casually, You are preparing for maternity leave, where do you get the money? Shouldn't she save the money for the milk powder? Linda had never been on guard against her, and said directly while eating delicious food, I have more than 5 million yuan. Yi Liangqiu nodded, and said understandingly, Oh, more than 5 million yuan. She smiled and said nothing. No, Sister Liangqiu. I mean, if you win the lottery. Linda sipped water, and a pair of eyes turned like a little black dog. Mr. Yi, there is such a rule in the company that people are not allowed to buy the lottery, is there? Yi Liangqiu put on the posture of a superior. Then have you won? Not yet. Linda said, twisting her fingers. She knew in her heart that Mr. Yi must be suspicious of her. By now, Yi Liangqiu didn't want to play dumb with her. She asked directly, The 5 million was the check Du Yuesheng gave you, right? That night, you spent the night with him in a hotel, didn't you? Linda's eyes shrank, and she didn't dare to say anything. Yi Liangqiu took a deep breath, probably confirming the truth. All right, then I'll get straight to the point. This child belongs to Du Yuesheng, right? Yi Liangqiu looked into her eyes. If you dare to deny it, I will call your family immediately and find a father for the child. She was quite domineering, and Linda was no match for her. She was overwhelmed by her aura, and after a while she whispered, He doesn't like me. Yi Liangqiu glared at her. What about the child? He was born without a father? Isn't that innocent? I have 5 million, Linda said in a low voice. Yi Liangqiu was defeated by her naivety. 5 million can't even buy a decent house in B City. How are you going to raise the child? Linda lowered her little face. I want to go to a smaller city. I can buy a house with $1 million or so, and the rest should be enough to live. I'll find another job. Yi Liangqiu stared at her for a long time, and then said slowly, find a job with 4 or 5,000, and spend the rest of your life there? Don't tell me that you can make a career by yourself with a child. Linda didn't dare to think about it. She didn't have any ambition. She just thought that having enough money was enough. However, Yi Liangqiu wouldn't let Du Yuesheng off so easily. It was his child, so how could he not take responsibility? Chapter 1898. She understood Linda's concerns. Girls always hoped to marry a man who loved them. At this time, Du Yuesheng obviously didn't trust Linda. Linda, let's leave it at that for now. I'll handle this matter. Yi Liangqiu patted her on the shoulder. If you really don't want to, I won't force you. If Du Yuesheng wants to snatch this child, I won't let him succeed. Linda bit her lip. Sister Liangqiu, thank you. No need to thank me. There was once a girl who called me Sister Liangqiu. She liked me very much. Yi Liangqiu's fingers gently stroked her forehead. Her expression was a little nostalgic. Linda asked in a low voice, is it Su Cheng? She used to be the secretary of the Su family, so she knew Su Cheng very well. Su Cheng liked Yi Liangqiu, but she ended up with Kaim. Yi Liangqiu smiled. That's right. Just like you and Du Yuesheng, you might end up together. Linda said weakly, we're not the same. Du Yuesheng looked like a man who had experienced a lot of romance. A little girl like her couldn't hold him down. Linda knew herself. Yi Liangqiu's thoughts were different. Du Yuesheng was used to romance, but the older he got, the more tired he was of women. At this time, they needed a warm home. Linda was quite cute. If Du Yuesheng accidentally found out that the child was his, he would definitely have some thoughts in his heart. Yi Liangqiu didn't stay for lunch. She went downstairs and got into the car. She looked at Qin Anlin and smiled. It's Du Yuesheng's child. Qin Anlin's slender fingers rubbed his chin. He wasn't surprised at all. Linda was a timid person to begin with. Who would believe a one-night stand? Yi Liangqiu made a call to Du Yuesheng, who was in a meeting. When she saw the caller ID, she immediately picked it up. Her voice was gentle as she said, Liangqiu, what's the matter? Yi Liangqiu mumbled, I just want to ask you something. How much is the salary of the nurse you hired for Linda? Linda wants her to continue working, but she's too embarrassed to tell Auntie Chen directly, so I came to ask you. As Du Yuesheng listened to the phone, she flipped through the proposal worth billions in her hands. With a faint smile on her face, she said, You can ask my secretary about this. He was the one who found him. Then he changed his words. I'll tell you later. Yi Liangqiu thanked him and continued to speak calmly. It's mainly because Linda has been pregnant for 2 months. She didn't vomit before, but her appetite has been a little bad recently. Her voice was neither loud nor soft, but it was loud enough for the higher-ups in the conference room to hear. Du Yuesheng looked around before getting up and walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows to answer the call. Liangqiu, what's the meaning of this call? I don't mean anything. Yi Liangqiu's voice was particularly clear. I just want to ask you about the salary of the nurse. Yuesheng, are you very busy? He gritted his teeth and said, I'm okay. Then let's talk about Linda. Yi Liangqiu's voice was a little cold. If her family knows that she's pregnant before marriage, I don't know how they'll treat her. Will they force her to abort the child? Du Yuesheng knew in her heart that she definitely did not make this call casually. So, he raised his hand and signaled the vice president to continue presiding over the meeting, while he walked out of the conference room. Chapter 1899. Du Yuesheng walked back to his office and closed the door. He sat on the sofa and loosened his tie. His voice was no longer as elegant as before. Did she tell you that the child is mine? No. She didn't say anything. Yi Liangqiu said lightly, Yuesheng, don't you want to verify this matter? It's hard to guess a young girl's mind. Du Yuesheng suddenly felt very annoyed. He closed his eyes and said, I asked her that night. She said it's not mine. Is that so? If Mr. Du is so sure, then we have nothing to say. Yi Liangqiu said indifferently, Don't worry. I will help her raise the child. I won't let her and her son live a miserable life. Du Yuesheng was silent for a while. Liangqiu, I'm engaged. On the day after he returned to Hong Kong, he was engaged to a socialite. Of course, there was no true love. It was just a marriage between two families. He had seen the woman in her early 30s. She looked dignified and suitable to be his wife. The engagement between two big families was not a child's play. Now that he broke the engagement, it would be a fatal blow to his family and the group. Du Yuesheng was a mature man and would not take risks easily. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. How could she not understand Du Yuesheng's situation? If he and Linda were to be together at this time, it would set off a huge scandal. If the engagement partner refused to let him go, then Du Yuesheng's situation would be even more passive. At this time, no matter what, she should not make things difficult for Du Yuesheng. However, she was still in a difficult position. The more it was like this, the more she had to make things difficult for him. At Du Yuesheng's age, he had to get married about half a year after the engagement. At that time, Linda would be about to give birth. Could he be the mistress? Du Yuesheng had been married once. If he married again, wouldn't he be the mistress? Originally, she did not intend to say it. At this moment, Yi Liangqiu said it very directly. Du Yuesheng, I will only say it once. Linda's child is yours. After saying that, she hung up the phone. On the other side, Du Yuesheng clenched his phone without a trace of expression on his face. When Yi Liangqiu called him, he vaguely knew in his heart. The phone in his hand was suddenly thrown to the opposite wall, breaking into two halves. If someone had told him a few days ago that the child was his, he would not have been embarrassed. But now, on the other side, Yi Liangqiu put down her phone and looked at Qin Anlin. I guess Du Yuesheng will return to B City soon. Qin Anlin looked at her. Then Linda, are you going to take her back? No need. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. We have to give them some space, don't we? Besides, would Du Yuesheng dare to bring her to Hong Kong? Isn't he afraid that his newly engaged Yiksha will kill him? Qin Anlin looked at her quietly. After a while he said calmly, Liangqiu, when I look at you now, I look like a Yiksha. What should I do? She pinched him and snorted. Don't touch me in the future. He smiled and drove. But after a while he asked shamelessly, what if you take the initiative to want it? Yi Liangqiu glanced at him. Anlin, don't you feel that you are no different from those middle-aged men now? Squinting all day long. He said solemnly, of course not. She knew that he would not say anything nice. Sure enough, he quickly said, they are not as good as me. Chapter 1900. Du Yuesheng came that night. He got the address through Qin Anlin. When two men were not rivals in love, everything was easy to talk to. Du Yuesheng arrived at 10 o'clock in the evening. He knocked on the door, but no one came to open the door. He knocked a few more times, leaned against the door, lit a cigarette, and waited quietly. The door was open from the inside, separated by a security door. Linda looked at Du Yuesheng with some wariness, her little face pale. Open the door. Du Yuesheng's voice was a little domineering. Linda shrank and took a few steps back. I don't want to. She was a little girl after all. So her voice was a little soft when she spoke to him. Du Yuesheng's eyes narrowed, and his face was a little gloomy. Then his fingers twisted the door lock. Linda was terrified. Was he trying to break her fingers? But she didn't expect that he would really break the lock. With a cracking sound, Linda immediately wanted to escape, but the door had been rudely pushed open. Then, Du Yuesheng walked in. When she wanted to escape to the bedroom, he grabbed her arm and scolded. Why are you running? Do you think I will eat you? He finally remembered that Linda was pregnant. So he gently wrapped her in his arms and carefully trapped her, not letting her move. At the same time he kicked the door shut. Linda's body trembled in his arms, like a pitiful little animal. In the dead of night, would he do her in anger? In the afternoon, Yi Liangqiu called her, and told her to be mentally prepared that Du Yuesheng was engaged. In fact, Linda had already thought it through. It didn't matter if he was engaged or not. At most, she could raise the child herself, and he just had to pretend that the child didn't exist. She bit her lip. But you look like you want to eat my child. Du Yuesheng stared at her for a long time. and there was helplessness in his stare. He really didn't care much about Linda, and he was just engaged. This child was his. When Liangqiu said it was his, he didn't doubt it, because Liangqiu wouldn't be so stupid as to lie. His voice was heavy. A few days ago, why did you tell me that I didn't have this child? Gently pinching her chin, his eyes are deep. Liangqiu smiled and said, if I say it's yours, what will you do? Du Yuesheng's fingers exerted a little more force. She was in pain, but she did not cry out. He leaned forward and stared at her. How do you know that I don't want this child? What about me? Do you want me? Are you going to take the child away? Or are you going to make me a concubine? Linda had a mocking look on her face. Du Yuesheng, stop being a hypocrite. If you liked me, you would have been angry when I told you that I had a one-night stand. You wouldn't have accepted it. As for you, you believed it so easily. Her fingers stroked her lower abdomen. This child came unexpectedly. I did take medicine after I got together with you. I'm not that cheap to get pregnant for money. Du Yuesheng felt uncomfortable when she described herself in such a bad light. After a moment of silence, she said, Linda, I'm sorry. Linda paused for a moment. There were many meanings behind his apology, but she was more inclined to the kind that he could not take responsibility for. Chapter 1901. He paused for a moment. As for this child, after he is born, I will give him 5% of the company's shares, so that he can live a carefree life. As Linda listened, her little face became paler and paler. She looked at him, as if she didn't know him, and was listening to a stranger. Very generous conditions. A sneer appeared on her face. She then poked his heart with her finger. Du Yuesheng, this isn't the first time you said something like this to a woman, right? You're very familiar with it. Du Yuesheng squinted his eyes and said unhappily, this is the first time. No woman has ever been pregnant for me before. No one is that stupid, or Mr. Du's measures are watertight? Linda sneered. Mr. Du must be in a difficult position now, right? Are you afraid that your fiancé will find out? She pressed on. Afraid that I will interfere with your family, right? Her voice was soft and mocking, however. Her emotions exploded soon after. Du Yuesheng, don't think that I don't know what you're thinking. You want me to help you raise the child, and be your mistress. You can even fly from Hong Kong to B City to relax when you're free, right? You have a family outside your home, right? Du Yuesheng's face was gloomy, but he didn't deny it. He wanted to smoke but held it in. After a while, his tone was a little tense. How much do you want? She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she tilted her head and looked at him. Do you know how painful amniocentesis is? She forcefully pushed him back a few steps and threw the phone at him. It smashed straight into Du Yuesheng's forehead, causing blood to flow down. Linda didn't even blink. Her voice was even colder. Is it very painful? You motherfucker, tell me, is it painful? She was as fierce as a lunatic. She was like the yiksha that Qin Anlin mentioned. Du Yuesheng was shocked by her. Even though his head was bleeding, even though Mr. Du had never been in such a sorry state in his life, he still stared at her blankly. Linda sneered and said, Mr. Du, I took 5 million yuan and we're done. As for what you leave for me, that's my business. You have no right to ask whether the child will go or stay. She threw something over and roared. Amniotic fluid penetrates your mother's balls. Why don't you go back to the furnace and get penetrated in your mother's belly? Du Yuesheng had never seen such a boorish woman. Furthermore, she was pregnant, and she was pregnant because of him. In the past, the romantic women who served him were as gentle as water, but the young lady in front of him was extremely fierce. He almost doubted whether coming to B City was the right decision. But, since he was already here, there were still some things that he had to deal with. Enduring her temper, he said calmly, I hope you can consider it carefully. This is good for both you and the child. Linda suppressed her temper and squeezed out a smile. Mr. Du, I won't be sending you off. She had thought it through. No, she did not need to think it through at all. He could go to hell with his aristocratic young master style. Moreover, if he wanted to discuss such conditions with her, he should be a young and handsome man. He was just an old man in his early 40s. What right did he have to bully her? Chapter 1902. He stared at her for a few seconds and said, "I'll come back tomorrow." He turned around and was about to leave. When he put his hand on the doorknob, Linda's cold voice came from behind. "You don't have to come, Mr. Do. We have nothing to talk about." He suddenly turned around and looked at her resolutely. "Mr. Do, don't worry. I won't take a penny from you, nor will I make trouble for you. I won't tell anyone that this child is yours. The existence of this child won't hinder your marriage at all." She closed her eyes. "As long as you don't appear in front of me again, I promise I will never look for you." At this time, she was wearing pajamas and her long hair was loose. Because of her pregnancy, she was slightly thin, which made her look very lovely. The warm yellow light shone on her delicate young face. Dewey Weshing stood there and looked at her. He thought of the night they spent together. It was so touching. Even when she woke up the next day, she was still a very likable little girl. But now, she looked at him like an enemy. In her eyes, he was despicable. Dewey Weshing also felt that he was meaningless. But he couldn't let her raise his child so crudely. After a pause he said, "I'll give you 1 billion. He looked into her eyes and said slowly, "If I don't have a child in 10 years, I will take this child as my heir." This was his biggest concession. Linda smiled. "Mr. Do, you should keep the money and get a few more wives. Maybe you can have a son." Her words were not pleasant to hear. Dewey Weshing was originally a noble person. After suffering for a long time, his forehead was also injured. There was a limit to how much he could endure, so he pursed his thin lips. "Think about it carefully." This time, she didn't say anything and let him leave. Dewey Weshing walked to the apartment building, where the black limousine was parked. When the driver saw him, he immediately got out of the car and opened the door for him. Under the moonlight, he was shocked. "Mr. Do, what happened to your head? Do you want to send it to the hospital immediately?" Dewey Weshing wanted to say no, but he felt dizzy and fell straight down. Before he fainted, he thought to himself, "Am I old? I can't even deal with a little girl?" The driver quickly helped him into the back seat and laid him down. "Mr. Do, please bear with it for a while. We'll be at the hospital soon." Fortunately, this was a good location. They arrived at the hospital in 5 minutes and were sent to the emergency room. Skin trauma plus a concussion was enough to put him in the hospital for a week. The driver took the scan and muttered to the doctor, "Who is this? How dare he treat Mr. Do like this? I must sue him to death." The wound on his forehead was actually smashed by someone. "Is Mr. Do unconscious now? When he wakes up, he must call the police." The doctor nodded. "It's nothing serious, but we still need to observe him." The driver took the scans to the VIP ward. At this moment, Dewey Weshing had already woken up and was leaning against the bed smoking. "Mr. Do, why are you smoking when you are so sick?" The driver stepped forward and took away the cigarette in his hand. "You have a concussion and need to rest more." Dewey Weshing wanted to smoke again, but the driver refused to let her. Dewey Weshing had no choice but to lie down. Moments later, she opened her eyes. "I heard you called the police?" "Yeah. Let's go." Dewey Weshing's tone was very calm. "I accidentally bumped into it." Chapter 1903. The driver was stunned by Dewey Weshing's words. Mr. Do seemed to like that little vixen a lot. Otherwise, why would he say that? However, he still had to listen to Mr. Do, hence he went outside to send the police away. Back in the ward, Mr. Do was smoking again. The driver sighed. "Mr. Do, are you worried about women?" Dewey Weshing leaned against the sofa and looked at the usually honest driver. She smiled. "Why do you ask?" The driver smiled and said plainly, "Because only women can make you so worried." He had been with Mr. Do for so many years. He had never seen Mr. Do in such a sorry state. If it wasn't a woman, then what was it? Dewey Weshing laughed in a self-deprecating manner. She took a deep puff of her cigarette. "If a girl is pregnant with my child, old Zhao, what do you think I should do?" The driver, old Zhao, was stunned. He stared at Dewey Weshing for a long time and stammered, "How can that be? Mr. Do, this matter. Why not? I am a man too. I will sleep with a woman." Du Yueshing's smile deepened. Isn't it normal to have a child if you're not careful? Old Zhao knew that sleeping with a woman would result in a pregnancy. However, Mr. Du was too careless. Wasn't he just engaged? If Hong Kong knew about such a scandal, would Mr. Du still want his reputation and status? Old Zhao stammered. This girl doesn't want to abort the child? Abort the child? Du Yueshing was stunned. Was that what old Zhao was thinking? Should he get rid of all the children who didn't meet his expectations? No, he had never thought of it that way. Other than being his own flesh and blood, he would not be so immoral to ask a young girl to abort the child for him. Regardless of the ending between him and Linda, he would never make such a request. Du Yueshing did not say anything. Old Zhao said gruffly, If it's not an important woman, leave it to me. I don't believe she won't be afraid. Du Yueshing had been involved in the underworld in the early years. Old Zhao had always been with him. Even now, he still had the aura of a gangster. He wanted to use underworld methods to get rid of Linda. Du Yueshing glanced at him. Since when are you in charge of my matters? Huh. He was not Ma Ziwei. Old Zhao immediately shut up and lowered his head. I was being presumptuous. Du Yueshing still looked at him. Watch your mouth. If this matter spreads, you will suffer. Old Zhao opened his mouth. What if there are rumors in Hong Kong? Du Yueshing thought of his sweet-tempered fiancé. If he were to get married and this matter was exposed, he believed that his wife would try her best to cover it up for him. A responsible wife. He did not know why, but just thinking about it made him unhappy. This matter was really not difficult, because Linda did not ask him for anything, and he could also see that this little girl would do what she said. She really did not want to be Mrs. Du. It was obviously something that could be solved easily, but he was the only one who was struggling here. It was ridiculous. It was probably because he was old and didn't have the boldness he used to have. Chapter 1904. The driver prepared a sumptuous meal, but Du Yueshing only ate a few mouthfuls and did not touch it. It was obvious that he was in a bad mood. Old Zhao was a boorish man. After a few words of consolation, Du Yueshing wanted to smash all the plates on him. In the end, there was no way to eat. He only smoked 2 cigarettes and went to sleep. Before he fell asleep, his dignified fiancé called and gently asked him about the dinner date tomorrow. Du Yueshing had actually forgotten about it. Previously, it was his secretary who asked him out. At this moment, she probably wanted to confirm it or deliberately nurture their relationship. He absent-mindedly apologized to her, saying that he was on a business trip and would only be back in 2 days. There was a moment of silence on the other end. In the end, his future wife tactfully did not pursue the matter, but bid him good night. She was a dutiful woman who gave men face, and was beautiful enough. He had nothing to be dissatisfied with. However, such a gentle woman could not stir up the waves in his heart, because beautiful women were too easy to obtain. All these years, which woman was not gentle in front of him? When Du Yueshing put down the phone, he convinced himself that she was different. She had a good family background and was capable. She was gentle to him because he was her future husband, and not because she was deliberately trying to please him. With this thought, he felt much better. But after lying down and falling asleep, he had a nightmare. He dreamed that his future wife went to be city and slapped Linda in the face, saying that she seduced a man. Du Yueshing woke up. After waking up, the hospital ward was cold. Only old Zhao was snoring at the side. After lying down again, he lay straight and did not fall asleep again. With great difficulty, he endured until the sky turned bright. He could no longer lie down. He got up and put on his clothes. Without disturbing old Zhao, he went downstairs alone. Early in the morning, the weather was very cold. Du Yueshing usually went to luxury cars or hotels, so he could not live without air conditioning. At this moment, he was only wearing a woolen suit. It was a little cold, so he hailed a taxi to Linda's place. He always felt that he should have a calm talk with her. She was still young, and did not know how difficult life was. Of course, he knew that Liangqiu would take care of her, but how could that be the same? He was the father of the child. He walked to her door, but did not dare to knock. Instead, he stood guard outside. It wasn't until the nurse came over and looked at him from the aisle that she asked hesitantly, Sir, who are you looking for? Du Yuesheng looked at her as she opened the door. Her voice was very calm. I'm Linda's boyfriend. The auntie smiled. Oh, she added. It's that scumbag. That's what Linda said. Du Yuesheng's face darkened. Is this how she talks about her child's father to others? Since you are here, let's go in. Whatever needs to be said has been said. It will save everyone trouble in the future. The auntie was rather ruthless. Every word she said stabbed at Du Yuesheng's heart. Furthermore, her salary this month was paid by Du Yuesheng. Du Yuesheng naturally did not care about this. All he wanted was to enter. As soon as she entered the door, she heard Linda's soft voice. Auntie, what do you want for breakfast? The softness that belonged to a girl was completely different from the dignified look of his future wife last night. Chapter 1905. When she saw him, her body instinctively retreated, and her tone was not good either. What are you doing here? After saying that, she ran towards the bedroom and wanted to close the door. But he was very fast and squeezed in with her. When the door closed, he held her waist with one hand and pushed her onto the bed with two gentle pushes. Linda was lying on her back while he knelt on his knees. His hands were firmly pressed on her, and his movements were considered gentle. Du Yuesheng, aren't you cheap? So what if you are pregnant? If you want, you can spread a lot of seeds, and a lot of women can get pregnant. Her face was red as she stared at him. Du Yuesheng gently trapped her, and his eyes were gentle. When a man wanted a woman, he would not be too rough, especially when she was pregnant. However, his gaze was so blatant that even a fool would know what he was thinking. Excited, right? Bending his knee, the two brothers of the Du family were pushed to 666. Du Yuesheng groaned and rolled to the side in pain. This woman was too hateful. Linda wanted to escape, but he pulled her down and she fell into his arms. Du Yuesheng gritted his teeth. Are you still a woman? If I'm not a woman, why do you want to do me? Linda's words became more and more rough. She didn't care about him anyway. Du Yuesheng took her hand. Help me rub it a few times. She refused and he stared at her. It's almost useless. Linda was forced, but she didn't let him off. You deserve it. After a hasty end, she shrank to the side and didn't speak. Du Yuesheng's pain had also eased a lot. Seeing that she didn't want to leave, he looked at her back and said in a hoarse voice, Don't you like me? In terms of looks and achievements, he was a man that women were infatuated with, not to mention his skills in bed. He felt that she had enjoyed it that night. But why was she so determined now? I don't like you. Linda's back was facing him, and her voice was muffled. Old Du, you should be glad that I don't like you. Otherwise, your future wife would probably be on the way with a knife. Her words made Du Yuesheng speechless. Old Du, his future wife. It was really the temperament of a little girl. But he was starting to like it. Yes, he really was a fucking bitch. Just like what she said, she clearly didn't like him. But he still didn't stop. Du Yuesheng fell silent for a moment before asking, If you liked me, what would you do? Linda thought for a while and then said, If I like you, I won't give up. She turned around and looked up at him. I'll ask you if you like me. If you like me, I'll be with you no matter what. Even if your old woman is richer and prettier than me, the one you like is me. She looked at him and said very softly, But you don't like me, so why should I like you? Du Yuesheng, tell me, if that's the case, wouldn't I be cheap? He was momentarily speechless. After a long time he said, Linda, you don't need to say anything. I know what you mean. You probably mean that giving birth to my child is already your limit. Forcing you to be my concubine is too much, isn't it? He raised his head. Maybe I'm used to it, thinking that women won't leave me. Actually. Chapter 1906. Du Yuesheng's heart was a little cold. He seemed to have fallen in love with the little girl, and hated him to death. The more he thought about it, the colder his heart became. Finally, he pulled her little face and said seriously, If it was in the past, I could like you, but now, I can't only think for myself. Linda looked at him and calmed down. So Du Yuesheng, for yourself and for the family behind you, don't come here again. It's not good for you. Du Yuesheng was stunned. After a long time, he closed his eyes and said softly, "That's it." He left her a business card. "This is my phone number." He paused and bent down to write down a set of numbers. "This is my secretary's phone number. If you change your mind." He looked at her deeply. "I won't force you to do anything you don't want to do, Linda. I just want to make it up to the child." He looked at her deeply. "I won't force you to do anything you don't want to do, Linda. I just want to make it up to the child." Linda sat on the edge of the bed and looked up at him. She suddenly felt a little pain. Originally, she didn't like old man Du. He was very annoying and refused to admit it. But now she felt that she had gone too far. In the beginning, if she had said that the child was his, if she had said that she liked him, and he wasn't engaged at that time, would it have been different? However, there were no ifs. He was engaged. He couldn't afford to be willful, and she couldn't be willful either. It wasn't her style to force a man to break up his engagement to be with her. She could only watch him leave. Even at this time, she knew that they had both been moved a little. It was possible that it was because the child in her stomach was their child. Du Yuesheng looked at her, reached out and touched her head, then walked to the door. When his fingers were on the doorknob, he suddenly came back and hugged her tightly. He pressed her face into his arms and kissed her forehead. "In the future, don't do this. Let me hug you for the last time." His feelings at this time overflowed all over his body. It was so hot. He thought that other than Yi Liangqiu, he wouldn't have such passionate feelings. In fact, the beginning of his love for Liangqiu was also because she looked like his ex-wife. It was probably a kind of nostalgia. Linda, on the other hand, was different. She was not the type of woman he admired, and he would not have the impulse to fall in love at first sight. But his heart ached for her. She was younger than him by more than 10 years, and the feeling of heartache was almost like a father's love. But it was different because he wanted her. Du Yuesheng kissed her forehead and said in a low voice, "I'm leaving. Don't hate me." Linda shook her head desperately in his arms. No. She was actually extremely sad in her heart. This man finally stopped pestering her. Actually, he had only been here for a day, and he had given up very quickly. However, she was still sad. She could also feel his sadness and his faint liking. "That's enough. That's enough. I'll be fine and so will the child," she said softly. "If you want to see him, I can send you a photo. Once a year, on his birthday, but," she smiled and looked down. "You have to remember to delete it." After she said that, Du Yuesheng hugged her even tighter. "Shan, you make my heart hurt." Chapter 1907. Du Yuesheng reached out and smoothed her long hair. "I saw it in the hospital." "Oh," she replied and stayed quietly in his arms. She was so obedient that it almost killed him. Shan. He wanted to say something, but in the end he didn't say anything. The empty promise made him feel a little nervous. Linda smiled and turned her head away. "Mr. Du, you should go." His body froze. After a long time he said softly, "In the future, just call me Old Man Du." That was more intimate. Linda was stunned for a moment and smiled faintly. "Do we still have a future?" He suddenly sighed softly and let go of her. "Take good care of yourself." "I will." She seemed to be a little overwhelmed. "Go." Du Yuesheng closed his eyes and finally left. The door closed. Linda looked at the door, and her eyes slowly became hot. In the end, hot tears dripped down, wetting the business card, and finally blurring. She threw the business card away. She said that she didn't want him to be responsible, so she wouldn't look for him again. She said that she would send him the child's photo to coax him. If that was the case, it would be unfair to the other woman. If she wanted to break up, she should do it cleanly. When Du Yuesheng walked out, he still told the nurse a lot of things. He gave her a check of 500,000 yuan and asked her to take care of Linda for 3 years. The nurse looked at the wound on his forehead and his depressed expression. She was a little confused. He clearly looked very concerned, so why couldn't he be with Miss Ning? When Du Yuesheng walked out, he leaned against the wall and smoked for a while. He had given up on her and the child. He was a man of his word. This child would not belong to him in the future, regardless of whether she accepted his gift or not. After returning to Hong Kong, Du Yuesheng asked his secretary to secretly transfer 100 million from his personal account to Linda. He didn't give her any shares, but chose 2 houses in B City. One was a villa, and the other was a Western-style house with a large terrace for her and their child. Sometimes, he stood in his office on the top floor and looked in the direction of B City, thinking that she finally had a guarantee. At least he still took care of her. But day after day, he looked forward to her calling, even if it was just her thanking him for the money. But no, he did not hear from her. Actually, he had her phone number, but he didn't have the right to call and disturb her life. He had promised her. But could it be bought with money now? Du Yuesheng stood high up and felt endless loneliness. Day after day, his secretary realized that his boss had developed a habit. Furthermore, it was getting worse by the day. He would always look towards the north. Du Yuesheng knew this himself, but he ignored this feeling. He would still occasionally go on dates with his fiancée, have a meal, or listen to a concert. It wasn't boring, but it wasn't boring. He didn't have any thoughts about his future wife. She had hinted a few times that she invited him to her house, but he had only had a cup of tea before leaving. Day by day, about 3 months passed. When there was only a month left until his wedding, Du Yuesheng felt that he couldn't hold on any longer. He wanted to see Linda. Just one look, and he felt that he could give up and come back to get married. Thus, he quietly came to B City and waited outside her neighborhood in the early morning. Chapter 1908. Du Yuesheng was waiting outside the neighborhood. He smoked and wondered why she hadn't moved into the villa he had arranged for her. He waited until 10 o'clock before he saw Linda walking out with Auntie Zhao. She looked like she was going for a walk to bask in the sun. The moment he saw her, Du Yuesheng's eyes narrowed slightly. His eyes were a little hot as he looked at her. Her belly was a lot bigger. It was almost 6 months. Even walking was a little strenuous. Linda chatted with Auntie Zhao as she walked. The sun shone on her little face, making her look much brighter. She looked like the happiest mother-to-be in the world. Du Yuesheng looked at her helplessly, feeling a little upset. If he wasn't engaged, would he be able to appear openly and accompany her? He felt an indescribable sense of loss in his heart. He looked at her longingly until Linda noticed his presence. The air became thin in an instant. Her throat felt like it was blocked. She stood still and looked at Du Yuesheng. Her lips moved, but she couldn't say a word. Du Yuesheng also stood and looked straight at her. Auntie Zhao coughed lightly. Well, I'll go buy some groceries. You guys talk. Auntie Zhao was about to leave when Linda pulled her sleeve and whispered, Auntie Zhao, don't go. Auntie Zhao sighed. It's better to talk. Auntie Zhao also heard that Mr. Du was going to get married in a month. If she didn't settle the matter, what would happen to Miss Linda? She purposely avoided them and let them talk alone. Du Yuesheng took 2 steps forward and looked up at the sky. He coughed lightly. The weather is pretty good. Linda nodded. She held her belly and walked toward a bench. Du Yuesheng hurried forward to help her. But Linda refused. She gently broke free from him and said indifferently, Mr. Du, don't bother. Since you didn't take it seriously in the past, you shouldn't in the future. She paused for a moment. I'm afraid I'll get used to it and can't change. Wouldn't that be too hard on you? Du Yuesheng still helped her to sit down. His heart was really pierced with 1,000 holes. Her little mouth was fierce. She knew how to hit the nail on the head. After a moment of silence, he said, I don't have any other intentions. I just want to see the child. The baby hasn't made a sound yet. You can't see him. Her fingers stroked her belly, and her voice was soft. Du Yuesheng was put on the spot. After a while, she said, Look at you. It's the same. Linda raised her face slightly and looked up at the blue sky and white clouds. After a long time, she said softly, Du Yuesheng, I really don't need your concern anymore. Of course, I'm very grateful for what you've given me. She had thought it through. If he was willing to give it to her, she would accept it. If it could bring her peace, she would not reject it. But she would never be ambiguous with him again. That would be degrading herself. She turned her head to look at him and said very seriously, Du Yuesheng, perhaps you miss me a little now, but that's because I'm pregnant, your child. But if you can forget about it and harden your heart, it's actually nothing, right? She said it casually, but he stared at her for a long time before saying, "No." She didn't say anything, and just looked in the direction of the blue sky. Chapter 1909. He had never been weak to a woman, and now he was. He wanted to beg her to give him the whole morning. Even if it was just to sit with her and bask in the sun, it would be good. "Linda, I regret it," he said. Her body trembled. She lowered her head and looked at him silently. Her voice also became soft. "What do you regret?" Du Yuesheng looked up at her seriously. "Shanshan, I regret giving you too much freedom." Her heart immediately sank. Sure enough, she still had a trace of desire. It turned out that she had never given up on him. After so long, this man was about to get married. When he said that, she actually had a hint of anticipation in her heart. Even if it was for the sake of the child, he was willing to give up the benefits behind marriage. So it wasn't. He had never thought about it. However, Du Yuesheng had thought about it. However, in the end, he still decided to continue with the marriage, so there was no need to tell Linda such a tasteless thing. That way, she would only look down on him even more. Even though he was doing things that she looked down on, and saying things that made her look down on him, he didn't care. Linda was stunned for a full minute. She looked at him for a long time and smiled softly. "Du Yuesheng, what do you want to do?" She smiled brightly. "Don't tell me you want to support me?" Actually, the money he gave her was enough to support her for the rest of her life. It was enough to buy 10 Lindas, but she was unwilling. How could Du Yuesheng not know that? He only said in a low voice, "Shanshan, let me see you once a month. Even if I don't go in, just sit here, okay?" Linda lowered her head and smiled. "You're forcing me to move, aren't you?" Du Yuesheng held her hand. "No, I just want to see you." He already knew that he couldn't let go of her. Perhaps he was despicable. He wanted to see her now, but he might not be satisfied in the future. However, he couldn't say those dark thoughts out loud. It wasn't the time. Linda smiled. "Mr. Du, it's not suitable." She held her waist. "Mr. Du, you're underestimating yourself. You're also degrading me and the child." Du Yuesheng wanted to say something, but she had already spoken again. "Mr. Du, if you regret it, you can take back the money and real estate at any time." Du Yuesheng's throat seemed to be blocked, unable to say a single word. He sighed. "I shouldn't have come today, but Shanshan, I really want to see you." "I know." She smiled a light and gentle smile. "Now I've seen it. Mr. Du, you should go back to Hong Kong. If you come here, it will only be bad for you." She was very understanding, and in his heart, he was even more disappointed, always feeling empty. Seeing him was even more disappointing and uncomfortable than not seeing him at all. However, he couldn't bear to leave. He was unwilling to do so. Du Yuesheng hugged her waist from behind and buried his face in the back of her neck, feeling the warmth of a young girl. His palm was placed on her stomach, where there was a small bump. "That is their child." Du Yuesheng's eyes were a little hot, and her voice was low and even pleading. "Shanshan, can you bear to chase me away?" Chapter 1910. Linda looked down. "Mr. Du, you'll definitely have your own children after you get married. There's no need to be so persistent." "Really?" Du Yuesheng hugged her and refused to let go. He buried his face in her neck and refused to let go. Linda made up her mind and struggled. "Du Yuesheng, are you going to let go?" "No." He hugged her and said somewhat roguishly, "I'll just hug you for a while." Linda closed her eyes. There was an inexplicable anger in her heart. She suppressed her voice and said, "Aren't you afraid of being photographed?" Du Yuesheng closed his eyes. "No one will be photographed. Even if there is, I'll suppress the news." Linda sneered. Yes, he was rich. He wasn't afraid of being photographed. At most, he would spend money to suppress it. As long as his fiancée in Hong Kong didn't know about it. Then what about her? Should she be criticized by thousands of people? "Du Yuesheng, if you continue to pester me like this, I'll abort the child." She threatened him with a cold voice. However, this little threat was nothing in his eyes. He even laughed softly. "Shanshan, you can try. I guess you can't bear to." His fingers squeezed her little belly, and he smiled delightedly as he felt the child move slowly. After that, he turned around and half-squatted beside her. He put his ear over to listen to the child's movements. Linda looked down at him and saw that he was happy like a child. However, he didn't know that his happiness was built on her pain. She was already tempted by him. Or rather, she had to give up after being tempted. It was already cruel. Wasn't his appearance even crueler to her? A man she liked, the child's father, had appeared, and he was someone else's husband. If he had any consideration for her, he wouldn't have done this. Isn't it good for each other to be stable? There was a faint coldness in her eyes. However, he didn't see it. At this moment, Dui Weshing was immersed in a little happiness. He was really very happy. He didn't know that his happiness made things difficult for her and made her suffer. He didn't know how cruel his happiness was to her. He was someone else's husband, but he asked her to be nice to him and asked her to see him once a month. She sneered in her heart and said softly, "Is it time for Mr. Du to leave?" Dui Weshing raised his eyes and looked at her in confusion. He thought that she would want him to stay a little longer. There was no woman who did not need a man's warmth at this time. But his Shanshan had a heart of stone. She smiled and asked, "Yes, Mr. Du should have left, right?" Finally, he slowly stood up and let out a long sigh. "I'll come back next month." At that time, Mr. Du should be on his honeymoon. Could it be that Mr. Du brought his wife to Be City for a honeymoon and told her that a woman outside had given birth to a child for Mr. Du? Her words were filled with sarcasm. How could he not hear it? He just rubbed her long hair and said softly, "I'll come over a week before the wedding." She laughed coldly. Yes, he came a week before the wedding, because he would be very busy after that. Busy with the wedding, busy with the honeymoon, busy with making love to his wife, busy with the baby. Then why was he still holding her child? Thinking about it, it was all ironic, and he would never know how cruel his words were to her. He said that he liked her, which was really a joke. Was this how he liked her? Chapter 1911. Dui Weshing looked at her deeply and reached out to pinch her cheek. His tone was a little gentle. "Be good and wait for me. Wait for him. Wait for him to come to Be City once a month." Was there any difference between her and those women who were kept by their mistresses? She sneered in her heart and took a step back. Her voice was very soft. "Dui Weshing, do you really like me?" He frowned. Shanshan, of course. He thought that he had made it very obvious. He was going to get married, and he took a big risk to see her. Wasn't that enough to show his sincerity? Linda looked at him, listened to his words and smiled shallowly. He said that he liked her. But Dui Weshing, do you know what it means to like someone? If you like someone, how can you push the other party into such an embarrassing situation? She didn't have the fortune to enjoy his love. All right, he said that he liked her. So she would like him too. A woman who didn't fight was the cutest. Then a woman who fought was probably disgusting. If this was what he wanted, then she would fulfill his wish. There was a hint of coldness in Linda's eyes. That little bit of love she had for him had also disappeared completely. Such a man didn't deserve to be liked by her. When he left her, he said that he had no choice but to leave. At that time, she really liked him. Now the man in front of her was not only despicable but shameless. Dui Weshing left, and Linda sat on the bench and looked at his back. She seemed to be very happy, because she had solved a problem, and could have a family in the future. Linda laughed softly, and her laughter was very sarcastic. After a while, she picked up her phone and called Yi Liangqiu. "Sister Liangqiu, I want to see you." An hour later, Yi Liangqiu's car stopped at the apartment building. Yi Liangqiu put down the hundreds of millions of yuan of cooperation and came to serve the pregnant woman. Actually, Linda was a strong girl. This time, it must have something to do with Dui Weshing. Yi Liangqiu thought to herself, didn't that old thing not appear for a few months? Why did they come to Be City instead of getting married? Women understood women. Yi Liangqiu knew Linda's mind like the back of her hand. Sitting next to Linda, she whispered, "What's wrong?" I asked Auntie Zhao, and she only said that Dui Weshing came by. Linda hugged her shoulder and rested her face on her shoulder. She said in a low and hoarse voice, Sister Liangqiu, am I really a bitch? What nonsense are you talking about? Yi Liangqiu gently stroked Linda's hair and said in a low voice, You're a good girl. It's not your fault. It was just that Linda was soft-hearted and didn't want to give up on this child. Otherwise, Linda would have a bright future. In fact, Yi Liangqiu could tell that Du Yuesheng liked Linda, but he was unwilling to give up on his family. She could understand, but what she couldn't understand was why they were making things difficult for him after he had given up. He came. Linda's voice had a hint of sobbing. Sister Liangqiu, I hate him. He is so hateful. And he even destroyed the only thing in my heart. He had made her feel embarrassed. Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly and kept comforting her. Be good, just ignore him. Let's move. Move to my place. I will protect you. Let's see if he still dares to come. Chapter 1912. Linda cried quietly for a while, then suddenly raised her eyes and looked at Yi Liangqiu. Her voice was firm. Sister Liangqiu, I want someone's phone number. She could guess what kind of person Yi Liangqiu was. She pondered for a moment before asking, Are you sure? If that's the case, it might push things to the point of no return. Linda smiled absent-mindedly. I'm not afraid. Didn't he say that he likes me? I want to see how far he can go. Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. That might also mean that it's impossible for you and him. Sister Liangqiu, I did hope for it. But at this moment, I just want to get rid of it. Linda gritted her teeth. Also, why do I have to endure it when he messes up my life? This time, it was her who took revenge on him and tore his life apart. If that was what he wanted. Yi Liangqiu let out a long sigh. Women were indeed creatures that were not to be trifled with. She was also worried for Du Yuesheng, but thinking about it, he deserved it. If he didn't leave a way out for others, he wouldn't be able to block his way. Hence, Yi Liangqiu got what Linda wanted for her a week later. Linda spent 20 days peacefully. Then, she received a call from Du Yuesheng. He said that he would fly to B City the next day. Linda received the call with a cold expression. Mr. Du, aren't you afraid that your fiancé will find out? Mr. Du should be very busy at this time. Compared to her harsh words, Du Yuesheng was much more sincere. Shan, I just want to see you. Linda softened her voice. Actually, I miss you too. When she said that, she felt that she was going against her will. However, Du Yuesheng was a little ecstatic, because she hadn't said a word to him yet, and he wanted to get her response. At this moment, he was thinking that he could give her everything. He could even secretly get a vasectomy and not have children with his wife. Shanshan's child was his heir, and he could give her all his love. Perhaps he couldn't give her marriage, but he could give her everything else. Du Yuesheng put down the cell phone in her hand and called her secretary. The secretary brought a sapphire blue box and placed it on the table. Du Yuesheng raised her hand and gestured for him to leave. After the door closed, Du Yuesheng opened the box. Inside was a pair of platinum rings with simple lines. It was clearly a pair for a man and a woman for marriage. Du Yuesheng looked at it for a long time, before he picked up the male one and put it on himself. As for the delicate female one, he placed it in his pocket. In his heart, there was an indescribable satisfaction. It was as if his life had been fulfilled by that little girl, and the world was dazzling. He smiled, remembering that she called him an old man. And now he, an old man, finally felt at home. Shanshan and their child. Du Yuesheng was already regretting it. He should have said that he would go today. Tonight's private plane could reach B City very quickly. If he was lucky, he could even spend a night at her place. Based on the number of days of her pregnancy cycle, she could have sex. He really wanted to do it with her once. Just thinking of this kept Du Yuesheng awake the entire night. She was somewhat excited. At 8 o'clock the next morning, he boarded the private plane to B City and arrived at her apartment at 11:30. He went straight to her apartment. Before he knocked, the door opened. He imagined her opening the door, hugging him sweetly, and saying that she missed him very much. Chapter 1913. Thinking of this, Du Yuesheng's face lit up with a pleasant smile. However, this smile ended at the person inside the door. That was his fiancée. Lin Shimon's gaze quietly fell on his fiancée's face, and he revealed a decent smile. Yuesheng, you're here. For some reason, Du Yuesheng felt disgusted looking at that smile. However, he was even more furious at that moment. That little woman who said she missed him last night. Lin Shimon, she was the one who invited him, right? Really? In order to get rid of him, she actually dared to do this. He didn't avoid it. He directly opened the door and walked in like a man of the house. Lin Shimon followed behind him and said in a very indifferent tone, I promised Yi Liangqiu that I wouldn't hurt Shanshan. However, Du Yuesheng wasn't in the mood to pay attention to her. His gaze was indifferent and cold as he looked at the pregnant woman sitting on the sofa. She was very pregnant, and she was holding her stomach as she sat on the sofa, as if she was hugging a ball. Du Yuesheng just looked at her like that was enough to make one's scalp tingle. His fingers were in his pocket, holding the plain white gold ring, and he felt a little self-deprecating. Look, Du Yuesheng, you wanted to give it to her, but she didn't want it. However, the moment he opened his mouth, his words were hurtful. Are you doing this to force me to make a decision? Linda's eyes were looking at him, as if there were countless little stars hidden in her eyes. Du Yuesheng only wanted to cover her eyes, because he couldn't bear to hurt her when he looked at those eyes. Yes. Linda's voice was hoarse. Du Yuesheng, you said that you like me. You're about to get married. And your fiancé is here too. If you really like me, then tell her that you don't want to marry her. You love me. As she spoke, she raised her chin with a hint of stubbornness. The veins on Du Yuesheng's forehead bulged. He suppressed his voice. Shanshan, stop fooling around. You know that it's impossible to cancel the wedding now. Ever since the announcement of the marriage, the two families had many collaborations. After severing this layer of relationship, no one trusted the other. She clearly knew that it was impossible for him to cancel the wedding, so she deliberately made things difficult for him, and deliberately made him let go of her. How could he not be able to tell that she had such a low level of cultivation? Am I messing around? Linda smiled faintly and lowered her eyes. Du Yuesheng, you were the one who said that you liked me. You were the one who said that you wanted to be with me. Am I making things difficult for you now? She laughed mockingly. I'm fighting for the child in my belly. Is that wrong? Du Yuesheng's face darkened. Lin Shimon, who was standing to the side, clearly had a much better upbringing than him. He was still smiling. Yuesheng, I don't mind you taking care of her, but you have to think this through. The successor of the Du family can only come from my belly. She was such a sophisticated woman. How could she not see Du Yuesheng's love for this girl? Du Yuesheng was no longer an impulsive youth, yet he did such a foolish thing. If it wasn't true love, what was it? She could fulfill his wish, but what about her love? What about her fondness? She had actually liked him for so many years. It was just that he didn't know. When she found out that he had a mistress outside, she was somewhat disappointed, but she was willing to tolerate it. Du Yuesheng looked at her, and then shifted her gaze to Linda's face. Now, do you still insist? Linda smiled absent-mindedly, watching them stand shoulder to shoulder, looking very much like a married couple. Chapter 1914. Linda said slowly with a resolute smile on her face. Yes, I insist. The veins on Du Yuesheng's forehead bulged and his voice turned cold. You know I can take the child away. Linda smiled and raised her little face. Du Yuesheng, she even said with a hint of contempt. Old man Du, are you sure that I will give birth to him? She said slowly, word by word. Du Yuesheng, I'm now 7 months pregnant. It's not impossible to abort the child, if you insist on taking him away. Do you think you will have the chance? His voice was extremely gloomy, and he stared at her viciously. In the eyes of the world, Du Yuesheng had always been a modest gentleman who never revealed his inner darkness. But at this moment he couldn't care less. He was flustered and exasperated in front of her, releasing all his viciousness. At this moment he almost wanted to strangle her. However, Linda ignored his anger and sneered. Mr. Du, are you going to take me back to Hong Kong? She leaned closer to him, Do you think you can leave B City? She straightened her body and held her belly, her voice becoming calm and composed. Mr. Du, you have to be fair and not be too greedy, right? Her gaze fell on Lin Shimin and she smiled. Unless you give up on Ms. Lin, otherwise, neither I nor the child will belong to you. Lin Shimin smiled. Ms. Ning is very sensible. Yuesheng, you should be more sensible too. She had the demeanor of a great master, as she calmly dealt with the problem her husband left behind. Du Yuesheng looked at her, and then at Linda. After a long time he chuckled softly. So, it was wishful thinking on my part. His words were filled with self-deprecation. Then he took 2 steps back and walked towards the door. Lin Shimin smiled and nodded at Linda. Ms. Ning, thank you. There was no expression on Linda's face, and her voice was cold. Ms. Ning, you're welcome. She didn't pause at all. You don't have to give me a check. Du Yuesheng has given me enough. If this woman wanted to insult her with money, she would be disappointed. She, Linda, had said that after taking 5 million from Du Yuesheng, the child would not belong to her. What he gave in the end was that he was cheap. Lin Shimin came from a good family. Now that he was scolded so mercilessly, he felt ashamed. In the end, he didn't even force a smile and quickly left. Aunt Zhao closed the door and sighed as she walked over to support Linda. Shanshan, why do you have to make things so difficult for yourself? She could tell that the person Mr. Du liked was Shanshan, not that prim and proper lady. But what was the use of just liking someone? In a man's world, there were definitely more than just women and children that he liked. A man like Mr. Du would not risk breaking up the marriage for Shanshan. Linda leaned her head on Ms. Zhao's shoulder and whispered, Ms. Zhao, am I being silly? She was still crying. Aunt Zhao wiped away her tears and comforted her. Actually, it's better this way. At least this time, he could truly give up. She was an experienced person. How could she not see that Shanshan actually liked Mr. Du? It was just that her heart was too stifled. No young lady would want to be treated like this. Chapter 1915. When Du Yuesheng reached the apartment building, Lin Shimin caught up to him and walked side by side with him. He didn't look too good, but he didn't look embarrassed at all. Lin Shimin sighed. Yuesheng, I know she was an accident. Du Yuesheng stopped in her tracks and looked at her indifferently. Sure, Min, if I say that she's not an accident and that I like her, what do you think you'll do? Yuesheng, you won't break up the marriage, so there won't be any ifs. Lin Shimin remained calm. Let's go back to Hong Kong and forget everything here, okay? Yuesheng, this doesn't belong to you. It shouldn't appear in your life. Lin Shimin's background made her believe that even if Du Yuesheng truly had feelings for her, no matter how bad the situation was, he would still choose to prioritize his own interests. After all, they were the same kind of people. Du Yuesheng looked at her determination quietly and suddenly asked, Shermin, do you love me? Lin Shimin didn't hesitate. He smiled. Of course. Du Yuesheng also laughed. Her laughter had a hint of mockery. Love. If it's love, how can you tolerate me liking another woman? What she felt for him was not love, but a kind of compatibility. Lin Shimin was a little embarrassed, but she still squeezed out a smile. Yuesheng, let's go. The car is outside, and the plane is also at the airport. It can take off at any time. Du Yuesheng's gaze landed on her face for a long time with a deep gaze. Lin Shimin could not hold on any longer. She could not figure out his emotions, and could not figure out if he really wanted to break up the marriage. She told herself countless times in her heart, no, he won't. He didn't dare. The cooperation between the two families had invested too much money. At this time, the news of their breakup was a big blow to the family business, especially the Du family. Her gaze slowly became firm and determined. Du Yuesheng looked at her face and the look in her eyes. She sneered. Shermin, I suddenly feel that women who are too smart aren't very cute. With that, he walked towards the RV outside. When he passed by the trash can, he took out something from his pocket and threw it into the trash can along with the thing in his hand. A silver light flashed past. Lin Shimin squinted his eyes, which were rarely sharp. She had a feeling that what Du Yuesheng threw away was something extremely important to him. Looking at his back, She stood by the trash can for a moment and pursed her lips. 24 hours later, Hong Kong. A pair of simple white rings for a man and a woman were placed on Lin Shimon's desk in a box. Lin Shimon sat upright and stared at it for a long time. She was not a fool. Of course she knew what this meant. This was thrown away by Du Yueshing in a fit of rage. Originally, he planned on giving it to Ning Shanshan to match her ring? Wouldn't she, Mrs. Du, become a joke? Lin Shimon closed his eyes. Du Yueshing, who do you take me for? The extent to which he liked that girl was beyond her imagination. It was so deep that she started to panic. Lin Shimon's body suddenly collapsed. At this moment, she could imagine how disastrous this marriage would be. He would eventually find that girl again, regardless of whether that girl liked him or not. They had a child. Lin Shimon chuckled. Yesterday, Du Yueshing seemed to have chosen her. In fact, he did it for the sake of the child, for the safety of both mother and son. Chapter 1916. The intercom on the desk rang. It was her secretary. Lin Shimon picked it up. The secretary's voice was sweet. CEO Lin, Mr. Du's secretary is calling to confirm the time for Mr. Du to pick you up for dinner. Another confirmation from the secretary. He didn't even give her this little bit of attention. But he had the time to go to B City to see that woman. His subservient manner was an eyesore to her. Lin Shimon had always been known for his good manners. He was the same type of person as Du Yueshing. At this moment he also flared up. He threw the intercom to the ground and smashed it. The secretary on the other side heard the loud bang, and was a little stunned. Was this the gentle CEO Lin? Lin Shimon stood for a long time. He bit his lip, and then picked up his phone to call the secretary. Tell Mr. Du's secretary to follow the original time. The secretary was silent. CEO Lin seemed to have changed back. But listening to him, there was something wrong. He was always different. However, no matter how wrong it was, in Hong Kong, Du Yueshing and Lin Shimon's wedding was extremely luxurious. The media was also in a frenzy for nearly half a month. But after that, something even more sensational happened. After a month of marriage, Du Yueshing and Lin Shimon divorced. The reason was that Du Yueshing had another woman outside. And more than one. Mrs. Du had been caught cheating every other day. She had had enough of it. What she couldn't stand was that he would rather find another woman outside than touch her. Lin Shimon endured for a month, and finally decided to divorce. At the celebrity law firm, Du Yueshing and Lin Shimon sat at opposite ends of the conference table. Compared to Lin Shimon's haggard appearance, Du Yueshing looked especially heroic. Her expression looked especially contented. And this contentment in Lin Shimon's eyes was especially glaring. She originally thought that he couldn't forget Ning Shanshan. On their wedding night, she understood him. Although she had expectations, they still slept separately. She thought that he would care about her feelings in a few days. But what she didn't expect was that a few days later, he started not coming home. The next day, she saw him in the newspaper. At that time, he was hugging a young model and laughing happily. Lin Shimon told herself that he might have been socializing with someone else. It was all just a show. But she couldn't stand it anymore. Every day, she saw the hickeys left by another woman on her husband's neck. Day by day she was about to collapse. Just like at this moment, there were still those eye-piercing bruises on his neck. Why? She covered her eyes. Yueshing, what did I do wrong for you to treat me like this? Her voice was exhausted. I can give you whatever those women can give you. I don't have any desire for you, Du Yueshing said bluntly, not giving her any face. Lin Shimon was stunned. She looked at him, her expression blank. Also, have you forgotten what you've done in the past? A cold smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Shermin, think about it again. Lin Shimon's face instantly turned pale. You did it for her? I don't like people controlling me. Du Yueshing's gaze was clear and shallow. I thought you knew me well enough. Lin Shimon's voice suddenly trembled. I don't want a divorce now. Du Yueshing took out a cigarette, lit it up skillfully and said lightly, actually, I don't want a divorce either. Chapter 1917. Du Yuesheng's voice was very soft, and of course very cruel. Shimin, we can grow old together. Lin Shimin looked at his expression and closed her eyes slightly. Du Yuesheng, you don't like me. This was a statement. But he did not deny it at all, looking indifferent. Yes, I have never liked you. Lin Shimin was stunned for a moment, then became angry. Du Yuesheng, then why did you marry me? His gaze was a little sharp. Shimin, what do you want me to say? Benefits? He said mockingly. Why do you have to humiliate yourself? Lin Shimin laughed, laughing until tears came out. This was her husband, the man she married. From the first day of their marriage, he had been thinking of revenge against her. Just because I sent our wedding photo to Linda, you want to do this to me? Lin Shimin laughed miserably. Du Yuesheng, do you think she will still want you? She began to say extremely vulgar words. You have done God knows how many times. Do you think that clean little girl will still want you? Lin Shimin said as she laughed, laughing and crying at the same time. She pitied herself and pitied Du Yuesheng. He probably did not know how much he liked that little girl. Yuesheng, you really shouldn't have married me. It's not easy to have true love once. Lin Shimin's lips curled up. In the future, let's go to hell together. Du Yuesheng remained unmoved and chuckled. No, Lin Shimin. I'm in heaven, and you're in hell. The unspoken rule of the upper class was that men could spend outside. But once a woman cheated, she would be doomed eternally. Lin Shimin persisted in this marriage for half a year, and finally fell in love with a young man who was 5 years younger than her. He was a pianist. His family was average, but he was talented. Lin Shimin spent a lot of money to support him, and as she wished, she obtained all the love of the young man. She avoided him at first, but later on, she brought her little boyfriend everywhere to attend banquets without any scruples. Sometimes she would even bump into Du Yuesheng. While Lin Shimin was feeling happy, she understood that she wanted a divorce. She did not ask for a single cent, and even offered some benefits, before she divorced and got rid of her identity as Mrs. Du on the night of the divorce. Lin Shimin anxiously found her young lover, and said that she wanted to marry him. But her boyfriend raised a check. 50 million, Mr. Du's promise. He leaned over and kissed her. Ms. Lin, you are very elegant. I'm also very open in bed, but I have a girlfriend. He then carried his luggage to the door and said softly, I've already checked out of the room, Madam Lin. Thank you for taking care of me all this time. Lin Shimin closed his eyes and said in a trembling voice, Don't you regret it? I have a lot of money. I can put you on the altar and make you a first-class pianist. I don't need to. I just want to be with the girl I love. Her young eyes said. Lin Shimin exploded. Then why did you betray her? The man was silent for a long time. She and I haven't had sex. This isn't considered a betrayal. When I have her, I won't have anyone else. With that, he walked straight out without the slightest reluctance. Chapter 1918. Lin Shimin stood alone in the hotel room. Her mind was filled with young people. She had almost forgotten about her ex-husband Du Yuesheng. But what did he say just now? He would never betray her after having her. Lin Shimin suddenly walked out. Her heart was filled with anger. Du Yuesheng lied to her. All of this was a trap he had set up. From the moment he neglected her, to the so-called mistress outside, it was all a lie. He had no mistress at all. He wanted her to take the initiative to divorce him. When she refused, he didn't object. Instead, he quietly found a man to seduce her. Such a husband was really qualified. Lin Shimin laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. This bastard. She drove all the way to Du Yuesheng's Qing garden. When she stopped outside the courtyard, she saw the servants moving the luggage into the trunk of the car. She knew very well where he was going. He was going to B City to find his little vixen. He was already so impatient after the divorce. Lin Shimin gritted her teeth. Her mind was filled with burning flames. She actually didn't love Du Yuesheng anymore. She loved someone else. But her current pain was bought by Du Yuesheng with 50 million yuan. If she didn't look for him, who else could she look for? She sat in the car and quietly watched Du Yuesheng smoke a cigarette at the door. Then she got into the car and started it. When his car slowly drove out of Qin Gardens gate, Lin Shimin gritted her teeth, found the right angle, and drove the car hard with a bang. The front of Du Yuesheng's car crashed into the wall of the gate. The front of the car instantly shattered, and Du Yuesheng fell unconscious on the spot. His fingers drooped, and 2 white rings fell from his palm. Then blood dyed everything red. He opened his eyes and wanted to speak, but he closed them again. He couldn't die. He had to go to B City. He wanted to apologize to his fool Shanshan. At that time he was angry. Although he had no choice but to get married, he could still think of a way. On the night of the wedding, he saw Lin Shimin send her a photo. He panicked. He felt how cruel he had been to Shanshan. When she saw it, would she cry for the whole night? That night, he called her phone, but she didn't answer. He didn't call again. He knew that she hated him. His scandalous news was not only for Lin Shimin to see, but also for Shanshan. He had hoped that she would be jealous, but she had not called or sent him a message. She was so heartless that it was as though he, Du Yuesheng, did not exist in this world. In the end, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He had sent people to protect her, and he had schemed against Lin Shimin. He had expected that Lin Shimin would take revenge, but he didn't expect it to be so ruthless. Women were indeed not to be offended. Du Yuesheng slowly closed her eyes. The police car and ambulance arrived together. Lin Shimin was taken away by the police car, while Du Yuesheng lay in a coma in the hospital for a month. After he woke up, he spent another month recuperating and dealing with company affairs. When he finally stood on the land of B City, Linda's child had already been born, and it was already 6 months old. It was a girl called Longyu. This name was given by Linda herself. When she said this name, everyone looked at her with strange expressions. She was still living in that apartment, living an ordinary life. Auntie Zhao was still with her and the child. Chapter 1919. She had long been a rich woman. She had heard about everything that had happened in Hong Kong. She had heard that Du Yuesheng was divorced, that Du Yuesheng was hit by Lin Shimin, and that Du Yuesheng was discharged. That had nothing to do with her. In the past year, he had not contacted her again. Everything was in the past for Linda. The early autumn, weather was cool and comfortable. Linda and Auntie Zhao were taking a walk with their child in the neighborhood. Little Longyue was lying in a small trolley, wearing a one-piece. Her sparse hair was light yellow, and it was hard to tell who she looked like. Overall, she was cute and good-looking, like she was of mixed blood. Baby, look, the autumn leaves are turning yellow. Linda sat down on a bench and bent down to say to little Longyue. However, after she said that, she realized that she had sat on this bench the last time Du Yuesheng came over. Du Yuesheng had even carried her here. Her expression became serious, and she frowned. Auntie Zhao's voice was a little stuttering. Mr. Du? Mr. Du? Du Yuesheng? Linda quickly looked up and saw the travel-worn Du Yuesheng. She couldn't believe it. However, he was really standing in front of her. Her eyes were a little hot, and she spoke rudely. What are you doing here? With just a glance, she realized that there was a long scar on his forehead. It was 5 centimeters long, and it had already turned pale white. It was probably caused by the car accident. However, he deserved it. He had affairs with many women in his marriage. It was lucky that he didn't die from the car accident. Du Yuesheng's expression didn't look good. He said, "In your heart, are you cursing me for not being killed by Lin Shimin?" Linda snorted. "I didn't say that. But in your heart." Du Yuesheng was old, but in front of Linda, he was like a scoundrel. Linda put on a fake smile. "Yes, that's what I think. What can Mr. Du do?" He looked at her deeply, and his dark eyes were filled with inscrutability. After a moment, his gaze fell on little Longyue. His gaze instantly became a lot more loving. The child should be half a year old. Even if he lives to be 1,000 years old, it has nothing to do with you. Linda snorted. Du Yuesheng didn't mind her coldness. Instead, she laughed and said, 1,000 years? Isn't that a tortoise? Linda pursed her lips. Yes, only a tortoise can give birth to a tortoise. Mr. Du's wife has a gigolo. If Mr. Du isn't a bastard, Then what is he? Du Yuesheng's gaze deepened. So you admit that little Longyue is my child? Linda was silent. His attitude was there, and he was an unwelcome guest. Auntie Zhao stood at the side. It was quite difficult for her because Mr. Du was single now, and he had the heart to ask for her help. However, his reputation over the past year wasn't very good. The butterflies around her came one after another. Although Shanshan looked indifferent, she must be very angry in her heart. At this moment Linda said softly, Auntie Zhao, let's go home. Auntie Zhao nodded. All right, I'll carry the baby. Du Yuesheng's eyes were a little hot. Why don't I carry him instead? Long Yu was already so big, but he had never hugged her before. This was his first child. Of course, he also wanted Linda to give birth to many children for him. They would start making babies tonight. Chapter 1920. Shanshan, open the door. Du Yuesheng called from outside, sounding a little helpless. There was no sound coming from inside for a long time. Du Yuesheng could only squat there and guard, looking very dejected. After sitting for about half an hour, there was still no movement inside. Is she determined to ignore me? Du Yuesheng touched his nose, feeling a little upset. He didn't care about his image and squatted at the door to smoke. He smoked for a long time, but there was still no one inside. He touched it with his fingers and finished half a pack of cigarettes. He turned his head and looked at the closed door again. He sighed and got up to knock again. This time the door opened. It was Auntie Zhao who opened the door. She looked at Du Yuesheng and sighed softly. Mr. Du, it's better if you don't come. Shanshan said she doesn't want to see you. Du Yuesheng knew that if he wanted to enter, he had to go through Auntie Zhao first, so he lowered his voice. Auntie Zhao, I'm single. There are a lot of single men on the street. If everyone comes, won't you see them all? Auntie Zhao sounded angry. Although he was single, he had divorced once and returned to his previous marriage. Mr. Du had been married once before, and did not expect it to be his first marriage. However, Shanshan was pregnant, and he was going to get married. What was the point of divorcing now? Was Shanshan a spare tire that had been pumped full? Besides, Shanshan had money and looks now. There was no need for her to waste her youth with an old man. Auntie Zhao thought immorally. Du Yuesheng was stunned. He was rebuked by an auntie. He coughed lightly and said uncomfortably, How can I be the same as those men? Auntie Zhao snorted coldly. You're not the same. Those men out there didn't abandon Shanshan after getting her pregnant. They still have the cheek to ask to get back together after getting divorced. Du Yuesheng had no place to hide his face. He actually lowered his voice and said, I'm sincere to Shanshan. Mr. Du, if you said that before the wedding, there would be some sincerity. Auntie Zhao said impolitely, Please go back. Du Yuesheng looked at Auntie Zhao helplessly. After a long time he said softly, Then I'll come back another day. Auntie Zhao glanced at him and snorted softly. Without saying anything else, she closed the door. She turned her head and looked at Linda. Her expression softened. Shanshan, I think he's sincere. Otherwise, why would such a big boss beg you like this? It's because of his family that he gave up on me. This is not his advantage. Linda hugged little Long Yu and said in a low voice. As for Auntie Zhao, she looked at Long Yu with mixed feelings. Long Yu, the name had two more Yu. It was clear that she couldn't forget Du Yuesheng. Anyone could tell, but she was too embarrassed to say it. Auntie Zhao waved her hand. Do as you see fit. Anyway, I think Mr. Du is a good person. He is much more reliable than those youngsters outside. After that, he added in a meaningful tone. When a man finds you after a divorce, it's usually true love. Auntie Zhao knows again. Linda muttered and pushed her. Hurry up and cook. I'm so hungry. Her voice was coquettish as she pushed Auntie Zhao towards the kitchen. This child only thinks about eating all day long. Isn't she afraid that it will be hard for her to get married if she gets fat? Aunt Zhao complained on purpose. Chapter 1921. Auntie Zhao glared at her and snorted coldly. Linda laughed and hugged her arm. Her voice was extremely soft. I know you love me the most, don't you? Okay, hurry up and cook. Auntie Zhao stared at her for a long time and thought. She clearly did it on purpose. Otherwise, why would she suddenly become so clingy? She wasn't like this before. Although she thought so, Auntie Zhao didn't say it out loud. If she didn't say it out loud, the little girl would be embarrassed. Auntie Zhao went to the kitchen happily. She was very optimistic about this couple. Women usually said no, but they were very honest in their hearts. Linda stood in the living room, holding the child. Her eyes were a little blurred as she looked at the door. It wasn't that her heart didn't waver, but when she thought of the gossip after his marriage, her heart turned cold again. Old and lecherous. He deserved the divorce. She played with the child. Although her heart was firm, she still felt a little uneasy. After all, Du Yuexing was outside. But now he should have left. Linda was uncertain, but at the same time, she was a little curious. So she looked at Auntie Zhao with a delicate face and voice. Auntie Zhao, go open the door and see if Du Yuexing has left. Auntie Zhao was cooking in full swing, and her voice was also loud. I'm cooking, I can't hear you. Linda said again, and Auntie Zhao's voice was even louder. The wind is too strong, I can't hear you. Linda was speechless. She looked at the doorknob, then walked over, hesitated for a moment and opened the door. In the end, as soon as she opened the door, her eyes met Du Yuexing's face. Separated by a security door, Du Yuexing's eyes were burning. Shan, I want to see the child. Let me hold him, okay? Linda instinctively took a step back and wanted to close the door. His voice sounded, if there is a lawsuit, I believe this child will be mine. After saying that, he paused and stared at her. Linda came back to her senses after a while, and her voice was a little exasperated. Du Yuexing, you bastard. Du Yuexing smiled slightly. If begging can't change your heart, then I don't mind being a bastard. Linda glared at him. One was inside, and the other was outside. After a long time, he opened his mouth and said in a slightly domineering manner, Open the door, or I will kick it open. She gasped. After a while, she abruptly opened the door. Du Yuexing, what exactly do you want? There was no longer any barrier between them, and he looked at her gently. He took out a ring from his pocket. Shan, I only wanted to give you this. I'm late by a year. As he spoke, he himself was somewhat moved. At that time, he was very afraid. On the night of his wedding to Lin Shimin, he knew that she would cry and be sad, so he divorced her as fast as he could. He had used some tricks during the divorce process, but he didn't want her to know. But he was very distressed. She didn't know and probably wouldn't accept him. Linda watched for a while before saying softly, Du Yuexing, it's too late. She paused and looked a little sad. Even if you took this out and gave it to me before you got married, I would still believe it. Chapter 1922. Linda said a series of words. There were tears in her eyes, and she felt terrible. What was he doing now? Was it useful to look for her now? He had gone through everything to return to her side. However, they did not have a past. Not even the slightest bit of affection. At most, they slept together for one night. At most, they talked about what to do with the child. At most, he said that he would give her money and let her be a mistress outside. How could these be considered feelings? These were the most despicable and shameless things. How could she still have expectations for him? Linda's eyes were a little hot. She glared at him with a bit of hatred. That little gaze made Du Yuexing's heart break. She hated him. Yes, she should hate him. He did not explain. He would rather be the bad guy, because only the bad guy could control her, and she would compromise. If she found out that there was so much sincerity hidden in his heart, she would be fearless and ignore him. His expression changed slightly, and when he walked in, he did not try to curry favor with Linda. Linda felt a little upset. She turned to the side and let him in. Seeing Du Yuexing holding his daughter with a gentle face, Linda could not help but say, Du Yuexing, you can come to see me once a year. She felt that she was being very generous, but Du Yuexing looked up at her and snorted. Once a year? That meant that he would only have sex once a year? A man like Du Yuexing had kept his chastity for her for more than a year, and he had long been holding back his anger. Tonight, he was going to have her. He looked at her indifferently, and the meaning in his eyes was unclear. Linda's body trembled, and she suddenly felt a little afraid. Regret? Du Yuesheng reached out and pinched her chin. Regret letting me in, right? Linda pursed her lips and whispered, No. You're so humble now. Are you afraid that I'll steal the child? His voice was still cold. Linda shook her head. No. She was completely confused when it came to the child, and she could only look at him. Because she knew his power, and because Longyue was his child, even Sister Liangqiu couldn't help her. She had no choice but to lower her head. Du Yuesheng didn't say anything else. The little bun in her arms didn't understand anything, but Auntie Zhao was still busy in the kitchen, so it wasn't convenient for her to speak. He pursed his lips, kissed the child again, and handed the child to her. I'll go help in the kitchen. Linda was a little surprised. What could he do in the kitchen? Du Yuesheng took off her coat and threw it on the sofa. She rolled up her sleeves and calmly walked into the kitchen. She skillfully helped Auntie Zhao cut the vegetables. In the end, the dishes were stir-fried by Du Yuesheng. It looked, smelled, and tasted great. Auntie Zhao and Linda were so shocked that their eyes popped out. He was born into a rich family. How could he cook so well? Du Yuesheng cleverly did not say that he had deliberately learned it to make his ex-wife happy back then. However, after a few days, his ex-wife ran away with someone else at this moment. He looked at Linda and asked indifferently, Is it delicious? Auntie Zhao also looked at Linda, and there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. Linda lowered her head and snorted. Actually, it was really delicious. An imperceptible smile appeared in Du Yuesheng's eyes. She pursed her lips and did not say a word. Chapter 1923. Auntie Zhao looked around and suddenly said slowly, Shan, something happened in my hometown. I might have to go back for a month. Do you want to hire a new nurse? Linda bit her chopsticks and was a little surprised. What happened? You have to go back to your hometown. Auntie Zhao's face showed a hint of shyness. Someone from my hometown introduced me to a man I like. I'm getting engaged when I go back. He will also come to be city later. Linda was stunned. Auntie Zhao was already in her 50s. Was she looking for a second time? However, when Auntie Zhao mentioned that man, her expression was the same as a young girl's. She must have liked that man very much. Linda smiled. Congratulations. If you get married one day, be sure to tell me. Auntie Zhao nodded. Of course. She then looked at Du Yuesheng and deliberately emphasized. Mr. Du, you can't bully Shan when I'm not here. Du Yuesheng smiled. Of course not. Linda felt that something was wrong when she heard that. She looked at Auntie Zhao suspiciously. Auntie Zhao was a smart person, and immediately put on an expression that said, You actually suspect me. Linda's head immediately shrank back. She must have thought too much. Auntie Zhao had indeed found her true love, and went back to her hometown to get engaged. She ate gloomily, and thought about how she would take care of the child for the next month. Or should she go to Sister Liangqiu's house for a month? It would also stop old Du's shameless pestering? Linda thought about it, and made up her mind. She looked at old Du and snorted. He was shameless. Auntie Zhao was very fast. After eating, she packed up her things and was about to leave. She had even bought the tickets. Linda's little mouth was wide open. This was too fast. It was hard not to suspect it. Du Yuesheng was very friendly, and took the initiative to send Auntie Zhao to the station. Auntie Zhao did not refuse. Linda watched them leave, and thought for a moment while biting her fingers. She immediately ran to the bedroom to pack her things. She didn't have many things, but Longyue had a lot of things. It was difficult for her to carry 2 big bags of things alone, not to mention taking care of a child. Therefore, she first put the things in the trunk of the car, and went back to pick up her daughter. But when she returned and opened the door, she saw Du Yuesheng sitting on the sofa. Little Longyue was lying on the sofa, and he was lovingly teasing the baby. Linda's blood froze. How did you get in? Oh, Auntie Zhao's key. Du Yuesheng raised it. Auntie Zhao was worried about you, so she asked me to take care of you. Linda closed the door slowly and said nothing. But you look like you're going out. Du Yueshing's voice was unhurried. Why? Are you trying to escape me? No. She bit her lip and leaned her back against the door. Du Yueshing, you're overthinking it. Is that so? He chuckled. If not, then bring your things and follow me to Hong Kong. I'm not going. Her emotional reaction was very strong. Du Yueshing laughed even more unbridled. Then we'll stay here, a family of 3. Who's with your family of 3? She said hatefully. Du Yueshing, let me tell you, now that you're in B City, I can kill you like killing a chicken. Don't go too far, or I'll make sure you won't be able to return. Just as she finished speaking, she was hugged. Chapter 1924. Linda was dumbfounded as she stared at the shameless man in front of her. Dumbfounded. Ecstatic. Du Yueshing continued to speak shamelessly, and then his large palm unceremoniously took advantage of her. Linda was embarrassed and angry. She struggled hard, but to no avail. Instead, as she struggled, their bodies became closer and closer to each other. She really had no choice but to lower her head and fiercely bite his neck. She mumbled, You bastard, let go of me. Bastard, of course I won't let go of what I got. Du Yueshing lowered his head and looked at the little girl in his arms. It had been almost a year since they last saw each other. After giving birth, her skin had become a lot more tender. In the past she was skinny and didn't have much meat, but now she was clearly a lot more plump. Du Yueshing hugged her like that, and his breathing became a little heavy. He rubbed and kissed her, wanting to die. Looking at little Longyue who was sleeping soundly, Du Yueshing, after an internal struggle, carried the woman in his arms and asked while kissing her, Where's your room? How could Linda be willing? She punched, kicked, bit, and scolded him, but none of this could stop the man whose brain was filled with sperm. Not saying, Then let's do it in Auntie Zhao's room. Who knows, there might be a different kind of fun. He bullied her too much. Linda bit his shoulder tightly and suddenly let go. Her long hair was messily scattered on her face, and her forehead was covered with fine sweat from the struggle. She growled at him. Du Yueshing, have you become a pervert? Du Yueshing laughed softly. You can say that after we're done. He had already kicked open a room door and carried her in. What was worse was that the door was not closed. She was thrown onto the soft big bed, and even bounced a few times. Her long black hair covered the pillow. Just when she wanted to get up, Du Yueshing had already bent one leg to press her down. Raising his hand, he began to unbutton his shirt. Linda was stunned. Was he for real? In fact, they had only done it once, and it happened after she took that medicine. It was such a long time ago. She hit her body and said softly, Mr. Du, calm down. Actually, we really aren't that close. Linda said and swallowed hard. My dear mother, isn't he already in his early 40s? How could those 6 rows of abs be so attractive? It exuded a chocolatey luster. In such a situation, Linda could still remember. He looked thin with clothes on, but he looked fat without. Du Yueshing looked at her little eyes and smiled slightly. Shanshan, you were pregnant with my child before. You said that you're not familiar with me, huh? He bent over her lips and said, almost against hers. We don't know each other well. How did my seed get into your belly, huh? His words were vulgar, and his actions were even more vulgar. He was obviously a man of noble birth, but at this moment, he was no different from an ordinary man. He looked as if he hadn't eaten meat for 10 years, and hadn't touched a woman for 10 years. His whole body was steaming, and his eyes were bloodshot. Linda started to get scared. She shrank back. But how could a man who hadn't touched a woman for more than a year let her go so easily? Her lips were gagged, and her palms were pressed to the side of her body. It was as if she was nailed to a cross, allowing him to enjoy her. She was so ashamed that her resistance and curses were useless. The old man panted and ate her, until not even her bones were left. Chapter 1925. She turned her face away unwillingly, a glint of tears in the corner of her eyes. Du Yueshing's body finally cooled down a little, He had originally wanted to kiss her, but he reached out and gently pinched her little face instead. His voice was a little hoarse as he said, "What's wrong?" Linda turned her face away angrily and ignored him. Even at this moment he was still dominating her, unwilling to let go. Seeing her awkward look, he didn't get angry. Instead he laughed. "Did I hurt you?" Linda glared at him. "No. If you didn't." His voice was unhurried as his fingers gently caressed her lips. "Then let's do it again." As he said that, he really started to bully her again. Linda was so angry that she cried. She twisted her little face and cried, "Du Yuesheng, aren't you in your 40s? How could he still have such good stamina?" She wasn't in pain, but she was exhausted. Du Yuesheng didn't stop. He lowered his head and kissed her, chuckling. "That's because you've starved me for too long." At this moment, she was already intoxicated. She couldn't tell north from south, and could only moan softly. After listening to his words, it took her a while to come back to her senses. Gritting her teeth, she glared at him. "Your wife, those women outside of yours can't satisfy you?" Du Yuesheng kissed her forcefully and fiercely. After kissing her, he said in a very low voice, "You're jealous, huh?" Linda opened her misty eyes, looked at him, and provoked him without a care for her life. "Old man Du, I think you're dirty." His eyes deepened as he chuckled softly. "Is that so? I'll see if you think I'm dirty later." Compared to her, he was a very experienced man. His methods were enough to torture her to the point that she wished she was dead. Du Yuesheng also felt that he was too polite and gentle to her, so he let go and tormented her. Originally, it was only their second time. He wanted to be gentle and give her a good impression, but now there was no need for that. She actually dared to say that he was dirty. 2 hours later, Linda was tortured to the point that she was on her last breath. Lying on her stomach, she said weakly, "You're not dirty." She begged for a long time before he let her go. She couldn't care less about cleaning up and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up again, it was already 6 in the afternoon. When she opened her eyes, she discovered 2 miraculous things. One was that her luggage had been moved back, and the other was that little Long Yu was currently eating in her arms. She did not move for fear of startling the child. She raised her eyes and looked at the seated Du Yuesheng. He was looking at her with a burning gaze. "I've never seen you feed a child before?" Her tone wasn't very good, and was a little hoarse. Thinking of how he had tortured her before, she did not have a good expression on her face. At the same time, she also had a headache. If Auntie Zhao was here, he would restrain himself, but now, she could only hope that Aunt Zhao would come back soon. Perhaps sensing her thoughts, Du Yuesheng said indifferently, "Auntie Zhao won't be back for the time being." She stared at him through narrowed eyes. Du Yuesheng lowered her head and kissed her face. "I was the one who invited Auntie Zhao. I spent 1,000,000 yuan. You're shameless." She angrily raised her hand to slap him. What he never expected was that Du Yuesheng did not dodge, and instead took the slap head-on. Linda was stunned. However, Du Yuesheng thought nothing of it. "I hurt you just now. Now that I've returned the favor, we're even." He shamelessly thought that he could continue tormenting her tonight. Just thinking about it made him happy. The 1,000,000 yuan was well spent. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.